And why don't we first open with prayer, center ourselves. Gracious and loving God, we thank you for another day, the gift of fellowship, the gift of hearing and learning and reconnecting. We just thank you for this time together, though it's virtual, we are connected. We are here for one another, and we are here to listen to one another and to learn from one another and to teach one another. We thank you for these many gifts, God. Amen.
Good morning, Kelly.
Is Kelly there? Yeah.
She is.
So,
hello.
I want to, on behalf of clergy and everyone here at St. Peter's, welcome you, Dr. Jones. And thank you for being with us this morning. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to the committee.
Okay, I'm offered to provide an introduction this morning. It's Clark here. And on the 4th, as you all have probably read, on the 4th Sunday of every month now, this forum is going to feature a series of speakers we're calling Sacred Conversations, Race and Community. And a group of parishioners came together last year after several new and heart-wrenching examples of racial injustice to discuss what we could do and as individuals and as a congregation to make a difference. It was decided to create this series to challenge ourselves and also to pursue new outreach opportunities in the St. Louis community. This series of speakers actually began in October with Blake Strode, the executive director of Arch City Defenders. And today we welcome Dr. Terry Jones, as known to a number of us. Terry is professor and dean emeritus at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. And I first met Terry 30 years ago, it seems hard to believe, as a participant in the Leadership St. Louis program, which he continues to be involved in and co-directed at the time. And Terry is widely known as an author and a real authority on the St. Louis community's history and current challenges. I don't think we could have a more insightful speaker on the topic that we're here to talk about this morning. He'll focus today on racial inequity and education in St. Louis. We thank him for being with us. Terry will speak with us, to us, for 20 or 25 minutes and then entertain questions and discussions. And before turning it over to Terry, just a few Zoom logistics for everyone. Please mute your microphone when you're not speaking. And when we get to the questions and discussion, please use the raise hand feature it's in the participants window, which is accessible through the icons at the bottom of your screen, or just type a question in the chat box so that we'll be sure to recognize you when the time comes. And that way we'll be sure that everybody has a chance to ask a question or make a comment. So Terry, thanks again for being with us, and turn it to you.
Thank you very, very much, Clark. And good morning, everyone. It's good to see so many old friends and to make some new ones. It's also an honor to follow Blake Strode, who is one of the extraordinary young talents in our community. And I've had the pleasure and the privilege of working with Blake on a couple of projects. And I might add, Clark, he's a graduate of the Leadership St. Louis program as well. This conversation that we'll have this morning is part of a growing movement addressing racial inequity, not simply in our community, but in the United States as a whole. And all of us understand, I think, that the first task when you take on a major initiative like this is to understand the nature, the scope of the problem. So that's what I hope to contribute in 20 to 30 minutes today before we enter into a conversation about the issue and address the kinds of possibilities and interests that you have that I could help you understand better and help myself understand better. Let's start with the obvious point that talking about any one aspect of racial inequity, in this case, public education, is only getting at a part of the problem, a part of the issue. There are many branches, jobs, housing, healthcare, and more, and they are all intertwined. But we'll only, for purposes of the presentation, we'll talk primarily, almost exclusively, about public education, and within that, K through 12 education. Why is it important to talk about that particular issue? Well, pretty obvious answer, and that is we have as a principle and aspiration in our country equality of opportunity, that every human being has an equal opportunity to participate in the governance of their community, and in our economy, everyone has an equal opportunity to a good material life. In order to operationalize that, to make that happen, you need public policies that contribute to that, that level the playing field. And the principal public policy that the United States has chosen to make that happen is public education. It started to do that in the early 19th century, and it's continued to do it to the present day. The scope, I'm going to be, as I say, we're going to be K through 12. Missouri, I'm only going to be dealing with the Missouri side of the St. Louis region and Missouri State as a whole from time to time. And I'm going to be only dealing with public policy. I think it's important to remember this, because we're not in this kind of conversation talking about individual inequities, not that they don't exist, they certainly do, or individual discrimination. We're talking about collective acts done by the community through its governing process to establish public policies that do or do not benefit everyone equally. And I'm going to do that by reviewing 7 episodes, 7 opportunities we had as a community, as a society, to make choices and talk a little bit about each one of those. I'm going to be talking about those that occurred early in the 19th century all the way through the present time. The first 2 of them deal with when we became part of the United States of America, when the Western banks and the lands on those banks became part of the United States. In the 1803 purchase, Louisiana Purchase, and then not too long thereafter, within 2 decades, the successful attempt to become part of the United States of America. Because undergirding all of racial inequity in the United States is the institution of slavery. Well, how did we stack, what was our position, our public policy on slavery as we became part of the United States and became a state? And the answer is we wanted it. That is to say, the majority of the free white males who were the citizens of the Missouri at that time wanted slavery to be practiced and wanted the power of the government to enforce that slavery, because slaves could have a bad habit from a slaveholder standpoint of running away. So that position went against the prevailing view at the national level. The founding fathers, who were still in control at this point, remember Jefferson was president, followed by Madison, knew that slavery was a contradiction, an hypocrisy. But their approach to that was to hopefully that it would wither away. And part of withering away was not to give it the opportunity to establish new territories, new routes. So the prevailing national approach was no more slavery outside the original states in the South that we're practicing it. So what Missouri was seeking, both through the territory of Louisiana and as a state, was to go against that policy, to be the exception. And it won, that is to say, it became the exception. And if we look at the laws of the territory of Louisiana, the District of Louisiana, we can see a point made that then echoed through the first half of the 19th century. And that point was that African Americans and people of mixed race were not human beings when it came to the law. They were property. And the laws made that very clear. In 1820, starting actually in the 1818 and 19, when Missouri wanted to become part of the United States of America and succeeded in doing that, it had to write a constitution. And in that constitution, it made it very clear about its position on the races and on the role of the races and on slavery. Let me read you a couple of parts of the Constitution of 1820. It said about the General Assembly, it shall have no power to pass laws for the emancipation of slaves without the consent of their owners or without paying their owners a full equivalent for such slaves so emancipated. It said that the General Assembly should have no power to prohibit the introduction of any slave for the purpose of speculation or as an article of trade or merchandise. So the slave markets would exist in Missouri. And then it also said it shall be the legislature's duty to pass such laws as may be necessary to prevent free Negroes and mulattoes from coming to and settling in the state under any pretext whatsoever. That's how we started. As we moved through the first half of the 19th century, we then had another issue come along. Well, if we have African Americans, and even though most of them were slaves, and about 90% of the African Americans in Missouri, antebellum period, were slaves, should we educate them, should or not? And the answer is by and large, no. The public school movement, the common school movement, started in the 1820s and 1830s. It coalesced in Missouri in the late 1830s. There was no movement whatsoever, and indeed a significant resistance to educating any African Americans using public funds. And so it did not happen. As the abolitionist movement grew, then the other issue was, well, should we prohibit the education of African Americans? Wouldn't that be dangerous? Wouldn't that give them additional tools to uprise and be insurrectionists? And in 1847, the state of Missouri passed a law making it a felony for anybody to educate an African American through anywhere in the state. And that law was enforced. So as we come up to the Civil War, we have a state in which it's against the law to educate an African American, where this public school movement has already started, but there are no African Americans being educated in the public schools, and indeed no education whatsoever that is legal in character. Well, the Civil War was fought. That changed that. The 13th Amendment of the Constitution was passed. Slavery was no longer allowed in the United States of America. And in 1865, Missouri passed a new constitution that then put the right to a public education as a constitutional right embedded in that document. Did it apply then? This is the fourth episode. Did that statement about a public education, did it apply to African Americans? And that was a controversial issue. And whether or not in the St. Louis public schools, which most African Americans in our area were in the city of St. Louis at that point, which at that point also included what we now call St. Louis County. And the controversy was settled by saying, yes, we have an obligation to educate them. The school board voted to do just that. But we're not going to spend a whole lot of money on it. And we're not going to devote the kinds of facilities to the education of African Americans that we do to whites. So in 1866, the city's public schools rented space. It's kind of a hand-me-down facilities at 3 locations to educate African Americans. And there were about 500 African Americans in those spaces. But it was a very limited type of addressing of the education. The fourth segment, and now we're going to slow down a bit because there's more details that are relevant, very relevant to understanding our history, is now we've already made a statement. We're going to educate African Americans. We're going to educate whites. We're not going to do it together. We're going to have segregated education. That was specified both in the Missouri Constitution of 1865 and its successor, the Constitution of 1875. How are we going to define separate but equal? I'm going to use primarily one thread of that to illuminate what the definition as worked out over almost the next century was, and that's high school education. First of all, before I do that, I want to underscore, I'm going to be relating over almost a century of public policy. That's a long time, longer than any of us on this call have been around. And so we sometimes tend to telescope things that have happened before we came around. Well, the people that were around before that didn't telescope. They lived these years year by year. So when the elementary schools were established for African Americans in rented space immediately after the Civil War, there was no high school for them. Remembering that in the late 19th century, a high school degree was basically the equivalent of what a baccalaureate is now. It was the key to being successful, particularly in the marketplace. So it was very important to have access to that degree, a quality high school degree. Well, what was the access to high school education for African Americans? Well, from 1866 to 1875, there was no access, but there was clamoring by, appeals by the African American leadership to have a high school for African Americans. The St. Louis School Board finally let one of the elementary schools start to offer high school classes. That school was in downtown St. Louis at 11th and Spruce. It was in rental space. And for the next 35 years, it was the African American high school. It was called Sumner, but it was a hand-me-down type of facility that was very less in terms of access to it. After 35 years of appeals for a high school that was designed to be such a facility, the St. Louis Public School Boards finally voted to build one on Cottage Avenue in North St. Louis in a neighborhood, the Ville neighborhood, and retain the name Sumner High School. And that building, that institution, 110 years later, still exists at that site, serving that same function. As I understand, we all understand that how long that will happen in the future is still to be determined. So from 1910, when Sumner opened in the Ville neighborhood, until 1927, Sumner was still the only high school for African Americans in the city of St. Louis and St. Louis County. That meant if you are a African American family and you wanted your child to receive a high school education, you had to find a way for that child to get to the Sumner facility in the Ville neighborhood. If you lived in St. Louis County, and there were several thousand African Americans in the early part of the 20th century in St. Louis County, in communities like Old North Webster Groves, Meacham Park, Clayton, the Carondelet facility neighborhood, the Evans Place neighborhood, Kinloch neighborhood in North St. Louis County. If you lived in any one of those neighborhoods, you also had to have get your child to Sumner High School, and you had to persuade your local school district to pay the St. Louis Public School District the tuition. So while almost every white in the city of St. Louis and St. Louis County could walk to a high school, African Americans up until 1927 had to get themselves to Sumner. Vashon High School was added in 1928 in the city. That building still exists. It's the administration building at Harris Stowe. A year later, Douglas High was opened up in the Webster Grove School District. That building still exists as senior housing in North Webster Groves. And Kinloch High was opened up in the late 1930s. Still only 4 high schools for African Americans. And by the time we get to the 1930s, we're talking about roughly 70,000 African Americans for whom those were the only 4 opportunities to go to high school. that was hardly separate and equal. If we used a couple of other metrics like dollars, and those are scattered in terms of the historical evidence, but when you look at things like per pupil spending and teacher pupil ratios in the white schools compared to the African American schools, almost always the white schools were about 25% better funded, or the teacher student ratio was 25% better in the white schools compared to the African American schools. 1954 comes along, and the Brown Board of Education decision is passed. How does St. Louis react to that? Well, the answer, there's good news and not so good news. The good news was that the St. Louis public schools have been preparing for desegregation. They thought it was going to be coming. They anticipated the court ruling. They had plans to how to deal with it. The school board president was a guy named Daniel Schlafly. For all of us who enjoy where did you go to high school and all the once degree of deference move, this is the father of Tom Schlafly, of Schlafly Bottle Works and Schlafly Tap Room. The St. Louis public schools did not resist at all the integration of their institution, but a way in which they did it didn't change things much. First, they went to neighborhood-based attendance areas, and the lines were drawn in a way to accentuate desegregation rather than alleviate it. Second, when they started to do some busing in the early 1960s, the busing was so-called intact busing. So they would take African-American children, and only African-Americans were bused north to south. There was no south to north, white to black area busing. They would take intact classrooms from overpopulated schools in North St. Louis, bus them down to schools in South St. Louis where there was open space, but they would not integrate the classrooms. So the buildings were integrated, but not the classrooms. Even recess was separate. There was black recess and white recess. There was black lunch and white lunch. So that was the first 10 plus years of the Brown decision. We don't even know the full extent of the neighborhood boundaries because for 10 years, the St. Louis Public Schools did not record attendance by race in any of its schools. So it was speculating some and anecdotes more than actual data. A group of African-American parents led by Minnie Liddell on behalf of her son Creighton said enough is enough. We're not getting integration at deliberate speed in the St. Louis public schools. About 90% of the African Americans in the St. Louis area were being educated in those schools. They went to the courts to do something about it. I could spend the rest of the day giving you the details of the Liddell case. It went on for 10 years, actually a little over that, from 1972 to 1983. But let's cut to the final portions of that in the early 1980s. At that point, remembering that whites were leaving St. Louis and had been leaving St. Louis at high rates in the 1950s and 60s and into the 70s, the ability to desegregate the St. Louis public schools internally was becoming less and less by the year. There were simply not enough whites to go around to have integrated institutions within the city. So the need was thought, everybody said, well, if we're going to have integrated education in St. Louis City and St. Louis County needs to be involved, and the school districts need to be involved. But an obstacle to that was a decision that the Supreme Court made in 1974 in the Detroit area, Milliken v. Bradley, that said you cannot involve county or suburban districts in a desegregation plan unless you can prove in court that they contributed to the problem, that they were wrongdoers in terms of creating the segregation. And that was problematic, whether or not that such a case could be made, although it was starting to be made. And there were particularly using housing policy in the St. Louis County during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. there was negotiations, followed by negotiations, followed by negotiations as to what to do. Judge Hungate, Bill Hungate, who was in charge of the case in the early 1980s, asked originally, can you all work out something on a volunteer basis? And then asked the Dean of the Law School of Washington U, Edward Foote, to try to see if he can make that happen, working with a citizen committee and with some of the parties involved. But when they asked in 1981, would districts step forward to be part of a voluntary integration plan of students coming from the city to the county, African-American students, only 4 school districts said they would participate in that. University City, Clayton, Rittner, and blank Pattonville were the others. Then, lacking the participation on a volunteer basis by the county districts, they were ultimately made a party to the case. And Judge Hungate then, and this is a fairly famous anecdote, and so my apologies for those of you who've already heard it. Bill, who was a friend of mine, I might add, and I'm just honored to say that, Bill called all the parties into his chambers, the lawyers and the superintendents, and said, well, you all cannot seem to me to agree about a plan where the county would be involved, county districts would be involved. So it looks like we're going to go to court. Don't know how I'm going to rule because I have to listen to the evidence, but I do know if I rule that the county districts were culpable, what my remedy is going to be. I'm going to wipe you all out. And we're just going to have one district, city and county. At which point, the county district superintendents and lawyers said, maybe we can work something out. So that then created the voluntary interdistrict plan, which had which allowed African-American students in the city of St. Louis to go to any majority white school, and the majority being less than 25% African-American school district in St. Louis County. The receiving school district would pick up the average per pupil cost, so it was a winner for them financially. The state of Missouri would pay the transportation tab for that. There was also the ability for county students to go to magnet schools in the city of St. Louis, so there would be white to immigration of students into the city. That plan went into effect in 1983, and by all metrics, it was a success. By the late 80s, early 90s, almost 15,000 students a year were going. That was over half of the African-American students in the city of St. Louis having the opportunity for integrated education in St. Louis County. Every white student in St. Louis County was in an integrated classroom, or certainly was in an integrated building, and almost all of them were in integrated classrooms. The test scores and the college attendance rates, metrics like that, of the African-American students on the transfer were going up. There was more money being spent on African-American education in the city of St. Louis because part of the agreement was that the city would receive still half of the state subsidy for each city student going to the county, even though the city was no longer educating those students. But by 1993, by the early 90s, support for that program began to wane. The state never was happy with the program because it cost them too much money from their perspective. It was costing close to, indeed, over $200 million a year. And so by that time, they were close to a $2 billion price tag. So they were looking for a way out. What is known in the courts is called as having the city declare unitary status. African-American leadership in the city of St. Louis, not all of it, but much of it, including the first African-American mayor in the city of St. Louis, Freeman Powsley Jr., thought the program was a brain drain, was taking the best and the brightest African-American students out of the city, and then the attention and of their parents were more directed towards the county than the city. So they were interested, African-American leadership, in having the program, those students come back to the city. Again, the courts asked whether or not the parties could reach an agreement. A 3-year process started in 1996, led by Dr. William Danforth, even then as now Chancellor Emeritus at Washington U. And in 1999, the city schools were declared unitary, and the voluntary plan, which was never voluntary from 83 to 99, because there was that stick, if we go to court, it might be a metropolitan district, became truly voluntary. And the voluntary interdistrict plan was succeeded by another voluntary program called the Choice Corporation. So we went from voluntary interdistrict coordinating council to voluntary interdistrict choice corporation to retain the same acronym. Under that approach, the program will continue of having students come from the city to the county for another 10 years minimum. And that happened, and not only was happened, it was extended 3 different times. So it will now end in the 2030s. I'll be happy to talk about the details of that program, but again, I don't want the larger picture to be ruled out and overcome by getting too deep into the weeds. But that program school districts can opt out. The Ladue and Rittner school districts opted out almost immediately. Subsequently, the Pattonville and Lindbergh districts no longer participated either. We're down to roughly 3,500 students participating in that program, African-American students coming from the city to the county. Their choices are a little more limited under this program than they were under the voluntary interdistrict plan. There are attendance areas in the city. That there's still much more demand for the program among African-American parents in the city than there are slots in St. Louis County. Because in St. Louis County, each school district gets to say, we will accept so many students, and then they can also specify the number by slots, by grade slots. Now, once they say that they're going to accept a student, they are obligated under this plan to educate that student until they graduate from high school. So, looking back on this history, we see until we get to the 1980s, it's all by and large creating more inequity, not less. We see a 10-year period, 1983 to 1993, and then going to the late 1990s, where it is going to more equity, not less equity, from the purposes of African Americans having more opportunities, more choices for their education, and whites having more exposure to African Americans in their classrooms and having greater diversity in education. And then we see from 1999 forward, a creeping gradual lessening of integration in the classrooms in St. Louis County, and for that matter, and also in the city of St. Louis. So let me stop with that, and we'll open it up for discussions and questions. And there's Gail McMullen. I haven't seen her in such a long time.
Terry, thank you. And again, if you all could type a question into the chat window or use the raise hand feature, the little button in the participants window, then we'll make sure that we see that you have a question or comment and want to recognize everybody and give everyone a chance. Katie, you typed an initial question in the chat window, I see. Maybe you could say it out loud.
Gosh, I've already forgotten. So I'm interested when you were describing the period right after Brown versus Board of Education, when you said that the St. Louis school system complied readily, or the school system complied readily. There was not a problem, but it didn't seem like there really was equity. I mean, it seemed like they weren't really complying. So I just wondered, since you had Schlafly as the president of the school board, were there others on the school board, or was it the city administration? What was the stalling factor? Obviously, the feelings of whites in the city, I'm guessing, but what actually enabled that to happen? Well, how did that go wrong?
as best can be determined, the phrase that I would use would be white man's burden. It was a paternalistic, well-intentioned paternalistic approach. The school board was all white. So the African-American share of the enrollment in the St. Louis public schools was about a third of the enrollment when this started in 1955. It grew rapidly to 2/3 within a decade.
Wow.
So that took the form of, we need to do more for African Americans. We certainly don't want to be a Norval Faubus standing Central High School kind of situation. We're a modern city. We're a corporate dominated city. We do things the right way. We do things in a civilized way. Then that was coupled with, but we don't want to upset those whites in South St. Louis too much because they could be of a real concern. So change needs to be very incremental, very gradual. As you see, it was just that. So much so that ultimately, after a decade plus of that, African-American parents said, that's not nearly fast enough or swift enough. There's still substantial inequalities. We need a better approach.
And can I just add to that, because I'm seeing another question from someone else. How did that compare with other cities?
Well, in terms of the style with which it's done, it compared very favorably. Again, we did not resist. There was no substantial resistance, as there was in many southern states, say Virginia or almost all of the southern states in one form or another. None of that. We're going to lead the way. We're going to show that it could happen the right way. But it was more concerned about the appearances of it than the reality of it. I think that phrase could be, that criticism could be attached to many other aspects of seeking racial justice in St. Louis, dealing with it because it's an embarrassment, not because you have a commitment to real racial justice.
And there was another question, actually, kind of also building on that, was there a proliferation of private schools at that time?
The answer is there was some movement by whites to the Catholic schools during that period. But the Catholic schools said, we're not going to be a haven for those trying to evade segregation. What it did more contributed to more was the suburbanization, the white flight out of the city of St. Louis into St. Louis County. The population of St. Louis County in 1950, Katie, was 400,000. In 1970, it was 1 million. 600,000 people in 20 years at about a pretty steady 30,000 person a year place. St. Louis County did not have open housing laws or ordinances. Not until the Housing Act of 1968 was passed did the sale or discrimination of housing by race was declared not under Constitution. It was declared against the law. It was the last of the Civil Rights Act. So there was actually very little black suburbanization in that period because almost all developers of either apartment complex or subdivisions said, we don't sell, we don't rent to African Americans. And that was okay. It was not against the law to do that. So between 1950 and 1960, while the number of whites in St. Louis County went up almost 300,000, the number of African Americans went up by less than 2,000.
I see Sandy Peters, I think you said in the chat window that you've got a couple of questions, right? And you're muted. Sandy, you're still on mute.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Clark. Katie asked them for me. Thank you very much.
Okay. Bob Duffy, nice to see you.
Hi, Bob.
You raised your hand physically. You have a question or
Katie.
comment?
Hi, Bobby. Ask away. You got some good ones, I bet.
Bob always has good questions.
I was interested in the fact that everything was so inequitable in terms of geography, that there was a certain understanding in the city that you really wouldn't be complying with Brown v. Board of Education because there was no busing at the time, and I think that the practicality of getting Black youngsters to white schools was very challenging for everyone. So could you address that and the fact that that continues till today?
So I had trouble hearing the last two sentences you said, Bob.
The racial segregation by geography continues to this day.
Yes, it does. That's a whole nother presentation and one that's very closely related to education, because as a society in most states, including Missouri, our public policy is that the attendance areas for public education will be neighborhood based. You go to the school closest to you.
Right.
That means if the geography is segregated, the education is segregated. And this geography and the housing in St. Louis area, including St. Louis City and St. Louis County, but also the other counties, is highly segregated. We are one of the most residentially segregated metropolitan areas in the United States. We're always in the top 10, and we continue to be so. That then creates the dilemma if we're going to have integrated public education and not integrated neighborhoods, then there needs to be some type of transportation system in place to make that happen. And then who gets bused? And traditionally in the United States, the answer is African Americans get bused. So if we're talking about while the 1983, 1996, 1999 really, period was the golden age of racial equity in public education in St. Louis City and St. Louis County, because of the thousands of African Americans having the opportunity to and taking the opportunity to be educated at a school of their choice. We also have to remember they did all the busing. That is to say, they did all the getting up at 6 in the morning, getting on the bus at 6:45, not getting home until 6 in the evening, living in two different environments, their neighborhood environment and their educational environment, in order to achieve that greater opportunity within education. And all the whites had to do to have an integrated classroom was to sit there.
Thanks.
Other questions, comments?
I think Catherine has a comment or a question.
Yeah.
I thank you so much. I really appreciate you bringing forward the history and the intention behind the history. And I know you said at the beginning that so much is interconnected. One of the things that struck me a few years ago around housing, if I remember correctly, is it wasn't always apparent on its face how this was done. And so, for instance, Ladue, one of the restrictions has been no multifamily units or dwellings. And that was one way to keep Ladue a place for people with more money and to reinforce that kind of segregation.
Yeah, the Ladue School District, on the other hand, includes both Ladue and several other communities, most notably Olivet, where there is multifamily housing. I mean, Ladue has its own history, pluses and minuses. And let me mention Ladue because it not as in a critical way, but in an analytic one, because it represents a choice that was made that really was not widely debated in the community, and arguments could be made on both sides. But it demonstrates our awkwardness and reluctance to engage in conversations about desegregation policy. If we go back 40, 50 years, Ladue had 10 elementary schools. Over time, that became clear to the administration in Ladue, the school board, that that was too many. They needed to reduce that by a significant number. And the numbers 4 and 5 were the ones that were most often mentioned. 3 of those 10 elementary schools were north of Olive, and they were primarily African American in terms of their enrollment. Now the issue is, well, what should we do? Should we close one of those 3, and then there will be only one elementary school north of Olive? There'll be enough students for that school, but they'll be 80 to 90% African American. Or should we close all of the schools north of Olive and take those students and place them 25% at Reed, 25% at Conway, 25% at Spady, and 25% of Old Bonham, the 4 remaining elementary schools, so that each one of those schools will have an integrated environment. So should African Americans, quote unquote, have their own elementary school north of Olive and Olivet, or should every elementary school in Ladue be roughly 75%, 80% white, 25% African American, with the African Americans being bused to the other elementary schools to make that happen? Andrea, how do you decide? I'm used to asking you a question, and glad
Well,
you didn't use that as a case.
no, it was not one of our case scenarios. I've actually been sitting here thinking about how special education falls into all of this. And with the choice programs, particularly now with slots being limited, if you're a child who has special needs, are you even eligible to be part of that choice program?
Well, yeah, special needs, no. The answer is the special school district in St. Louis County and its equivalent in the city of St. Louis Public Schools were never merged or coordinated. So they were not part of the voluntary interdistrict plan.
Terry, one of our members.
Ladue chose, by the way, the second of those options. So it buses African American students from north of Olive to the other elementary schools, which results in you can go to a block in the African American neighborhoods in north of Olive, like in the Meadows, and on that block, some of the youngsters will be going to Reed, and some of them will be going to Spady because to even the numbers out.
Terry, one of our members typed a question in the chat window or a comment, and the fib continues that Missouri casino revenue and lotto revenue will lift all boats of education, quality, and fairness. How does that relate to all of this?
Well, that's a whole another strand here in terms of public policies. How should we fund education? We started to fund it through the property tax. That was the original way common schools were funded in not simply the city of St. Louis, but in most other parts of the United States. And we have continued to that tradition over time of having local property taxes be the principal source for the funding of the schools, which means the more assessed valuation you have in your district per pupil, the better off you will be financially, all things being equal and not so equal. Starting in the 1970s, people looked at the 14th Amendment that said states should provide equal protection of the laws, and said, well, public education is part of the state's responsibility. It's mandated in most state education, state constitutions, including Missouri. Doesn't it have the obligation to say that there's the same amount of dollars behind each student, not have gross inequalities in funding for those students, such as the property tax system produces, Clayton, as opposed to a Normandy, where a large part of our population is in cemeteries, or is owned by public entities such as the University of Missouri St. Louis. long story short, the state said, no, it doesn't have to be equal, series of Supreme Court decisions, but each state does need to have adequate funding. So one of the other strands of this debate is do we want to contain, retain, or change the way in which we fund public schools? We've made some changes. We've gone from public schools being almost totally locally funded to being a blend of state and national and state and local funding with a little salt from the national entity, which moves towards more equity, the national funding, or do we want to start from scratch and do it another way?
Linda, you have a question in the chat window, but why don't you go ahead and speak up?
What do you think needs to be done to increase quality education for predominantly African American school districts?
First of all, this is it is a very active matter of discussion. And it's a debate that's another uncomfortable debate to have. Since I have now I have several leadership grads. I'm talking about you, Bobby. I'm talking about you, Gail. I'm talking about you, Clark. That in areas such as the Leadership St. Louis program, and that is the model going forward. If we're going to retain neighborhood schools particularly, and if neighborhoods are still going to be residentially segregated primarily, can we actually in 2021 and going forward achieve separate but really equal? This is the so-called Black college model. Spelman and Morehouse are great institutions. Why can't we have public school districts, all African-American or nearly all African-American, that are Spelman and Morehouse school districts? Or is integrated education in and of itself necessary to have the kind of equality in our society that we're seeking, which was the ruling in Brown v. Board of Education? I'm not going to come down on either side of that discussion. I am going to come down solely, and this is not intended to be a cop-out. That should be a major dialogue and then decision that we as a society, I'm talking about the United States, Missouri, and the St. Louis region, make, as opposed to dance around and we don't talk about that in polite company.
Now we are, which is good. Chris, I'm sorry I skipped over your question. Is there any intention to close any of the historically Black high schools?
Yes. St. Louis City Public Schools has too many buildings. And so.
Yeah, and I guess as you pointed out, Terry, Sumner is sort of on the bubble right now. I guess.
Well, yeah, it's on more than it's on the hit list.
Right, right. Alan, you have a question. Go ahead and speak up. Thanks.
Thanks. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Jones for just a great presentation this morning. It's been very informative, and I've learned a lot about the history and what's led us to where we are today. I guess part of my question was just answered, but I would ask, are there examples in other municipalities across the country in recent times, say over the last 10, 15 years, where they have made changes to their public school systems to try and improve the lack of equality between education for whites and minorities? And can we learn from those examples?
The answer is there certainly have been no shortage of efforts. There has not been any ringing successes. Let's talk about this in two ways. One is education quality as measured by things such as test scores, college attendance rates, and then also measuring it by diversity and having diverse experiences at the educational level. Taking the second one of those first, the Supreme Court made decisions in about now 15 years ago in 2007, in cases coming out of the Seattle School District and out of the combined Jefferson County, Kentucky has a single school district. Louisville is within Jefferson County, Kentucky. In both of those situations, the school board had made public policy, because they're the public policy makers, that diversity in their schools was good, particularly in the middle and high schools. And therefore it had pupil assignment policies based on diversity. So that each high school would only, if the district was 50% white, each high school would have between 40 and 60% white, that sort of policy. That can no longer, the Supreme Court ruled in 2007, those violate the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. White parents sued in both districts, and that's the resulting decision. So the ability under the current constitutional interpretation, and that was a 5-4 decision, which I suspect now would be either 6-3 or 7-2 decision. That's not an option right now, not a policy option, tool option. In terms of public schools, looking at central city school districts is the first example where there's been the most evidence of trying to do things differently. The districts that have had the most success are ones that have had continued leadership. And Chicago, even though it still has a long ways to go, is better than it was 15, 20 years ago. It benefited very much from Arne Duncan's being head of that district for over 10 years and having a systematic policy. The St. Louis public schools, which had a real churn in terms of leadership throughout the 80s, 90s, and the 2000s, ever since Kelvin Adams has been there, and it's now over 10 years ago, the progress has been incremental, slow, but in the right direction. So consistent leadership seems to be very important.
Katie, you posted a question that's probably a good concluding question for this group. Seems to be asking, what can we do now? Over to you.
Just specifically, what can our group do? What can the people on this call do to try and improve the situation? And then we probably ought to, we're probably running past time, so then we ought to probably wrap up. And I'm sorry, we'll maybe try to get some answers to these other questions from Terry later on that we can post online or something. Thank you.
Well, first of all, congratulations on what you're doing, trying to understand the issue. Don't mean to pick on Andrea, but we teach our public policy students the first thing you need to do and what you need to spend the most time on is understanding the problem. So don't rush to a solution without fully understanding what the nature and scope of the problem is. If I had to give advice, it would be get involved in the public policy making within your local districts. And so let me end with that anecdote. And it's one that's not a particularly encouraging anecdote. The Voluntary Interdistrict Choice Corporation, the Danforth Agreement, was put into place in 1999, had a 10-year window. And so what if it was going to be continued, that decision needed to be made by school district boards in the 2007-2008 period in the St. Louis County. The support for continuing it was primarily among the leadership of those districts, particularly the appointed leadership, because they thought it provided a strong value to have a diversified student body in districts like a Clayton or a Rockwood or a Parkway. They did not want, though, to make it a regional issue for fear that if it became an issue in school district elections, that people who are favorable or okay with participating in VIC would say, nope, we're going to have, they would start to emerge candidacies opposing participation in VIC and with a platform to get out of VIC as soon as possible and accept no more students from the city. Let them educate themselves. So they said, let's be cool about it. This low key it. So that's what's happened. And the lesson there is there was a limited constituency as they perceived it, and I think they were perceiving it accurately, a limited constituency for doing things differently in terms of racial diversity within their school districts. So Katie, back to your question, school districts leadership needs people within their districts who are supporting doing things that promote racial diversity and promote racial understanding. I think the district that's probably the leader now, as I perceive it, and I work with a lot of these districts in San Luis County on programs like this, would be the Rockwood district.
Well, Terry, we're at the end of our hour, and we thank you very much for being with us this morning and for all the information and all the insight you've shared, and frankly, for the challenges that you've left with us.
Well, thank you all very, very much. I very much appreciate the opportunity.
By my count, we've had about 50 people in this session, which is
Yes.
terrific.
Yes.
The session has been or is being recorded, not for publication on YouTube or someplace, but it'll be available within the parish. And I want to mention that the next speaker in this series on February 28th will be Michael McMillan, who's the CEO of the Urban League of Metropolitan St. Louis. A number of you know him. A number of us participated in an event that Alan Ivey organized at the Urban League as part of its food giveaway program, actually a couple of times in the last several months. So please come back to hear from Michael, a terrific leader. Turn it back to the Reverend Shug or the Reverend Kelly for any last words, any benediction here. Thanks.
Yes. Dr. Jones, thank you so much. I'm very happy to say that my work with these wonderful people at St. Peter's has been so life-giving as we do this work together. And thank you for giving us good information so we can do good works and maybe get in some good trouble.
John Lewis lives.
That's right. Absolutely. The legacy lives, and the legacy will live on through the work that we do. So I'd like to offer a prayer as we close. Gracious God, thank you so much for the willingness of these hearts and these hands to do the work you have given us to do. We come to you with open spirits, open minds, and open hearts. And we will seek to continue to do the work, to sow the seeds, and to bring forth good things in your kingdom. Amen.
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 Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Thanks,
Have a
everyone.
good day.
Come to Bible Brew next week.
That's a shameless plug.
Thank you, Terry.
Thank you.
That was
Thanks.
really wonderful.
Thanks so much, Terry.
Thank you.